I have here a painting of a trio of magpies. There's a lot of gold leaf going on in this painting in the background. Some of it is imitation gold leaf, some of it is 24 karat, and there's also some mica pigments as well to make everything all nice and sparkly. I'm going to show you how it happens. I start off the painting with this base background layer of imitation gold leaf, and I adhere it to the paper using Daniel Smith white watercolor ground as well as Daniel Smith translucent watercolor ground. I sort of dab it on using a older brush so as not to ruin the hairs of a good brush, because I do a bit of a rough treatment with these brushes as I dab and smush and press the gold leaf onto the page. The next phase is to start on some washes, and I do this with both watercolor as well as some Winsor & Newton Indian ink black, which has a very nice granulation. After that has a chance to dry, I start to pull out details that appear in this sort of abstract way. I'm starting off here with a white gel pen and creating these flowing lines that are a little bit reminiscent of a dragonfly's wing patterns, though in a much more abstracted way. I continue adding these throughout the piece, and it's not a planned structure that I am doing. I sort of use the randomized background that I created in those initial phases with the wash and the granulation pigments, and I just follow where it feels good to sort of put these and to add flow and movement to the painting as a whole. At this point I switch to some finer detail brushes. So this is a number 0 round brush, and I take some concentrated pigment and I start painting into the little spaces in between those cells that I created with the white gel pen. I do this via dry brush, so it's a very meticulous shading process. And I also do some inverted versions where the lines are painted dark and the cells interior are the light areas with the white gel pen. So doing both ways like this adds variety and interest to the piece and the textures that I am creating in the background. Periodically, as I go, I take a damp brush and I swipe it across the page. This allows the pigment to blend a little bit and to smooth out, as well as to soften the harsh line edges. And I proceed going back and forth like that across the whole painting. So as I work, the flow and the feeling of it develops, and I use that to figure out where to go next with these abstract-y textures that I am creating. So next, when I finally get to painting the magpies themselves, which was almost lost underneath all the textures and paint that I had created. So I did have to go back at some point and redo my pencil lines because my magpies had nearly vanished, and I wanted to maintain the composition that I had initially had in mind without having to redo it entirely from scratch. But I start laying in these dark colors as a base tone for the wings and the head of the bird, and the white areas, which are the tips of the wings on the underside as well as the breast, are white. And so since I have all these layers of color already darkening my background, I'm actually going back with white watercolor ground in order to create these white areas. I also try to keep the edges softer so that it's not a hard textured edge, raised edge with this white watercolor ground, which can be easy to do if you're not careful because it's quite thick. And I also use it to soften up the surrounding background area negative space so as to make the dark of this magpie jump out a little bit more and stand out from the darkness of the background. After I have those initial layers in, I start to do a little bit more fine detailing, and I'm not going to be completely rendering the details of every little feather in this bird because this painting is not meant to be of that sort. It's a little bit more distant and hazy, and so everything is a little bit softened. And I want to create some texture to the wings, but not to the point where I am delineating each and every feather, more just to get the color tones and the feel of texture of feathers. Again, this is mostly dry brush as I work in these areas. I add a little bit of texture to the background as well with some blues that fit with the existing colors there, and this sort of emulates the texture that the granulation created, but in a more defined and intentional way. So this is where I meld the randomization that created via the granulation with my much more planned and intentional sort of texturizing. Continuing to darken the tones of the magpie so that it's this very rich dark black. I'm actually using Payne's Gray so that there is a little bit of the black from the Indian ink texture showing through. This gives it much more of a rich layered look. And then to top it off, I add a little bit of sparkle with some of these mica holograph paints. And that just gives it a little bit of an extra bling factor when you see the painting in person. This is one of the fun things about working with watercolors and looking at the original paintings. There are these textural visual details that don't show up sometimes in the videos or scans or digital versions of it. Likewise with this kind of gold mica in the surrounding area. This ties in the bird with the background textural gold elements so that it doesn't feel like it is a separate thing. The base colors for this second magpie was done just as with the first one, with some black glazes for the main dark feathered areas and using white watercolor ground for the white markings. And then I'm taking a small fine brush to do some little bit of a gold halo around the edges, kind of keeping it soft though so that it's not too harsh of an edge. And then here we go on the third and final magpie. I love using the mica pigments here in these really dark areas, and it gives it just this subtle shimmer and bling, and it's just so much fun. I love any excuse to use these. Now along the edges, I soften them up a little bit by lifting so that there aren't hard boundary edges between the magpie itself and the background. I want to keep everything nice and soft so that it has an integrated feel. You see that especially on the lower edge of the wing feathers, especially on the left wing there. Once again, I'm adding a little bit of the gold mica paint in the surrounding area to give it this bit of a halo effect. working it into the negative space around the wings and around the feathers. And at the same time, also trying to keep to that texture that the background has. So I'm not painting in a smooth, graded wash or anything of the sort. I'm sort of having it a little bit speckled, a little bit dotted, letting it go into all the crevices of the physical texture that I created using the watercolor ground in those early stages. Letting the brush and the pigment get caught on the peaks and crevices. And adding a little bit of a highlight on the face and the beak, the head and the beak of this bird with some white gel pen, as well as a little bit of feather highlights here. Just a touch. Again, because I don't want to be rendering all the feather details here. I just want to hint at feathers and have the viewer feel that sense of featheriness in the body, softening the edges of the tail there. And now I'm getting to this hoop, which is going to be a gold hoop. I was going to say gold, but it's not gold yet. So you'd be wondering, what am I talking about? Here I am using buff titanium as a base because it's a little bit closer to the gold color, so that if I have any of it showing through once I add the gold leaf, it won't be very noticeable. Not that very much of it should show through. And you can see here how it's very thick, and it actually adds a element of physical relief to the painting. Now I'm letting that dry. Meanwhile, moving on to these red thread ribbons that the magpies have in this tangled little webbing. Just using a fine point 0 round brush with alizarin crimson permanent. I love permanent alizarin crimson. It's such a deep and gorgeous red. And it's light fast. The old alizarin crimson was not light fast, which made me sad until they came out with this. Adding a little bit of highlights. And now we get to the fun gold leaf stuff, because that watercolor ground has dried and I've painted it with Maniatum gold leaf sizing, which is a gold leaf glue. It has sort of a latexy, rubber cementy type of feel to it, and you paint it on and let it dry for about 20 minutes. And then it has this tacky texture that the gold leaf can then stick to. And here I have the 24 karat gold leaf, which I am now spreading onto that sizing and brushing it off the excess with a soft brush. There isn't going to be a ton of excess. There's a little bit of big chunky pieces, so I'm sticking that away into my jar of extras. One day I plan to make some shell gold with this, but it will be a long while before I collect up enough dust to do so. And then I just keep rubbing it in, and as I do this, the flakes break up into smaller and smaller bits until it becomes just gold dust, and then it all sticks in there and makes it wonderfully shiny and golden. Then I'm taking a little bit of my mica paint once more, and I'm going to use this to sort of blend the hard edge of the gold into the painting Just as with the magpies earlier, where I used this mica paint to give them a bit of a halo, that's sort of what I'm doing to the actual gold here as well. And this helps it to meld better with the background. So it does not look like I simply stuck gold leaf on top of my painting, but that it is integrated fully. I keep using that word because that is really important, I find, with all the elements of a painting. You want to make sure that everything integrates well. There are a lot of components and a lot of different techniques that you can use and that I use. And in a vacuum, each of these then becomes its own thing. But to have a painting feel unified, you have to find some way to meld and integrate all of the elements into one so that one thing shifts into another. So the gold shifts into the paint, shifts into the random textures, shifts into the defined intentional textures. All of that creates a unified whole. And there we have the finished painting.